Hi, and welcome to the Podcast Business Lunch. Or if you're on the West Coast, Podcast Business Breakfast. And I guess if you're in Europe, it's the Podcast Business Dinner. At any rate, welcome. I'm Brad Hill, and today I speak with Ivone Schramm. She's the Market Operations Manager for Triton Digital. That means she oversees the programmatic operation at Triton. And we talk about how it works, how it's priced, and some interesting trends as well. The Podcast Business Lunch is sponsored by Triton Digital and also by NPR.
Triton Digital is the global technology and services leader to the digital audio and podcast industry. Triton provides innovative technology to broadcasters and podcasters to build their audience, maximize revenue, and streamline their day-to-day operations. In addition, Triton powers the global online audio industry with Webcast Metrics, the leading online audio measurement service, and Podcast Metrics, one of the first IAB-certified podcast measurement services in the industry. To learn more, visit us at tritondigital.com.
This lunch is sponsored by NPR, a leader in audio journalism and storytelling for over 50 years. NPR delivers international, national, and local news and programming to audiences via radio, podcasts, and digital platforms. NPR offers brand sponsors an effective and measurable opportunity to connect with its 138 million monthly users who rely on the trusted and valued content provided by 35 news bureaus around the world and hundreds of public media member stations in communities across the country. NPR resonates with listeners and creates a compelling, uncluttered environment for your brand to do the same.
We're grateful for the sponsorship and support of NPR and Triton Digital. Without that support, the Podcast Business Lunch would not be possible. And now, here's my conversation with Ivone Schramm. Ivone, thanks for joining the Podcast Business Lunch. It's good to see you and talk to you.
Nice to see you, and thank you for the invitation.
Oh, you're welcome. Glad to have you here to talk about programmatic advertising in podcasting, a fascinating topic. Podcasting is not traditionally a high-tech media category, I think it's safe to say, but it has adopted some automated solutions recently. And I'm thinking of dynamic ad insertion, whereby the host of a podcast can pre-record a sponsorship message so that instead of baking it into one episode, it can be dropped across an entire catalog of episodes. That's obviously a step forward in automation and marketing efficiency for advertisers, but that's not exactly programmatic, I think. Tell me if I'm right about that and explain the difference.
You're right, that's not exactly programmatic. So as you explained very well, dynamic ad insertion, it's when a creative ad is recorded separately from the episode and it can be inserted in a catalog in multiple different episodes for the same show, for the same host. And dynamic ad insertion also allows that ad to be replaced every time there is a new download for that episode. So if you download like 3 weeks after that episode went live, you get one ad. And if you download like 3 months later, you might get a different ad for the same spot because there is the possibility of replacement. Programmatic is actually the use of automated technology to buy ad spaces. So dynamic ad insertion is part of the process for programmatic to deliver an ad. Programmatic is when, for buying ad space, buyers participate on an auction. So meaning they bid for the right to insert that episode to the listener. The SSPs or supply side platforms like Triton, they insert dynamically the winner of that auction into the podcast during the download.
So pricing is variable.
Pricing is variable, and also position is variable. So they can be in the front, at the beginning before the podcast, in the middle of the content, or the end.
And then what does the advertiser deliver? They must have a pre-produced ad ready to go so that if they win the auction, they have something to actually run.
Exactly. So the advertiser on their side, they use what's called DSP or demand side platforms. And those demand side platforms, they enter the campaign, the price that they are willing to pay, how much they are going to bid. And a DSP communicates with the SSP during the auction. The SSP receives the bids from Triton is connected to 30 different DSPs. So we get 30 different bids for each auction for its spot during a podcast. And the highest bidder wins. When it decides the winner, it asks for the DSP, do you have the creative? And the buyer has already uploaded the creative into the DSP site.
All right, we're deep into buzzword territory here. So explain to our audience, please, DSP and SSP.
So SSP is the acronym for Supply Side Platform. An SSP, it's a technology company. Triton, for example, is an audio-only SSP. And this type of company is what we do. We hold a marketplace. And marketplace is where the bid exchange happens, where we have, think about as a NASDAQ, for example. This is also a marketplace, but we have one that it's for audio, that is our SSP. So it's a technology company that provides to supply, meaning the publishers, the radio stations, the podcasters, on space to expose their inventory to the DSPs, so the demand side platforms. And this is used exclusively from buyers. So the buyers will enter, buyers like agencies, brands, trading desks. They use those GSPs to enter their campaign. And in the campaigns that where they upload the creative, the dates of the campaign, how much is, like for how long it's going to run, daily budgets that they have for spend or impressions, for example.
The advertiser is bringing creative with them and auctioning for an opportunity to put that creative into podcasts and also into other forms of streaming audio, by the way.
That's correct. So in the DSP, or the demand side platform, they will also say what type of targeting, so what type of people they are looking for, like what the brand is looking for. And the SSP will take all that information with on the publisher side, on the supply side, where they can put different parameters for what they want to accept, including pricing or priority, and it will automate a solution or a decision for who gets that.
Okay, we'll get to those priorities that the advertiser has in a minute, but is there competition then? Is your company in competition with others every time an advertiser comes in with a campaign need?
So the demand side platform there is always a competition. Today, Triton is connected to over 30 demand side platforms or DSPs. So every time we have a listener or a space for advertiser, we expose that to all 30 DSPs.
Okay.
And they all bid back, giving what's the advertiser and the price that they are ready to pay for it.
Okay. Now, what are the advertisers actually buying in the way of demographics or audience segmentation and targeting? Because I think programmatic is largely about reaching a certain type of audience and a certain listener. Is that right?
That is right. And what they are buying, it really depends on what the campaign is. For example, in podcasts, we see a lot of difference from depending on the time of the year, right? What type of buying they are seeing. For example, in the United States, we see food and drink being very strong during the holidays, like for Thanksgiving and for Christmas. And we see that type of podcast having less interest from the buyers at the beginning of the year.
Okay.
And the UK, we see that food and drink keeps interesting for the buyers at the beginning of the year too. When buyers are coming to podcasts, they are for sure looking for the experience that the podcast brings to the buyer, to the listener. So podcast listeners, they are more connected to the content than just like listening to the music while doing other things. So they are. You take like some podcasts can take up an hour, right? So you take that full hour to listen to a subject that it's interesting for you, that it's for one of your interests. And buyers use what we call categories to target those listeners through the podcast. So
what are some of those categories?
One category an example, and that it's very popular lately, is true crime. So those are podcasts talking about crimes that existed, so people that made research or have different content around really real crimes. You can have podcasts.
So sorry to be so interruptive.
Mhm.
So to some extent, advertisers are buying a topical category in podcasting.
Exactly.
Okay. What other categories? Are they buying audience characteristics regardless of what kind of podcast they listen to?
In podcasts, audience characteristics not very rich, especially if you compare that with streaming.
Okay.
So when buyers are looking for podcasts, they are looking for a specific title, meaning a specific show that they know the host and that they are looking for it, even if they come programmatic, or they are looking for those formats of the podcasts.
Okay, that's interesting. And I'm interested in that comparison you made. So is it safe to say, as I try and figure out how to phrase this, that programmatic buyers of podcasting are less demanding, perhaps, or the audience in podcasting is less well defined and less granularly targetable than in streaming audio? Is either one of those true?
I wouldn't say that they are less demanding. I would say actually the opposite, that they are way more demanding when buying podcasts, especially for the nature of podcasts, right? It's a host that represents a brand within that podcast. So they want to make sure that the client is landing on a podcast that matches what the client believes. It's more on the data side, podcasts, when you're looking purely at data campaigns, podcast never scales as good as a streaming campaign scale, mostly because of the type of connection. Let's say it's podcast, it's a download. When streaming, you can have it's a streaming, so you can have like first party data information from the listener that is given to a pure play. You can have addressability, meaning a player sync, a cookie sync, IDFA is passed via the players from the broadcasters.
Is podcasting changing in this regard? It sounds to me, if I'm hearing this right, like podcasting has some catching up to do with streaming audio. Is that fair to say, or is that a wrong characterization?
Podcast is wall garden download over the places that you listen, right? So when you are listening, depending on where you are listening to the podcast, those places don't pass back to the SSP any type of detail. That's the difficulty that the SSPs have today in selling and passing more data to the buyers for the podcast.
Thank you for being so patient with these questions, by the way. I feel. Programmatic in podcasting is relatively new. What are the benefits to the buyer? Pretend that you're talking to a new buyer or a podcast marketer who hasn't used programmatic in the past. What would you say the benefits are?
I think it's the benefits of programmatic in general, not just podcasts.
Okay.
So flexibility in programmatic is a big benefit for buyers. They have full controls of their campaigns, right? So they change the creative whenever they need the creative to be changed. The campaign starts when it's ready to start. And you don't have that communication with the publisher that you send an email, then, and so the buyers have that on their fingertips. Like it's time to change the creative, the buyer changes the creative, and it's more reactive.
So control,
it's a big advantage for buyers. Another one, it's a scale. So connecting to one unique SSP through their DSP of choice, they can have access to millions of impressions and avails per day. For example, Triton's marketplace today have access to over 250 publishers globally. It translates to 1 billion avails per day. So
is that just on the podcasting side?
No, that's the total, not just on the podcasting side.
What are the main differences from the buyer's point of view between a programmatic podcast campaign and a programmatic streaming audio campaign?
One of the big difference it's the data that we just talked about. When streaming offers much more possibility of data targeting, detailed data targeting, podcast offers the data possibility when you go or use IP addresses. So you cannot go into IDFA, like identifier for advertisers, for example, level. You have to stay in the household level using the IP address. Differences also on the formats. Streaming use broadcast formats, so will be rock, classics, top 40, sports. When podcasts can be more detailed, offering the formats that describe a little bit more the intent of the show. And as we talk, like true crime, arts and craft, food and drink. There is one that I think it's funny that it's magic and illusion. So there is podcasts about that.
I have never even encountered magic and illusion as a podcast category. And you're telling me that there's some advertising demand for it?
There is, yes, there is advertising demand for it. For example, we see in Canada this year a lot of the advertising demand for podcasts that talk about learning. So if you're looking for a certificate, learning a little bit more and growing your career. Also entertainment podcasts, so talking about TV shows or movies. There is a huge interest lately in Canada, especially for this type of podcasts.
One of the most popular podcast categories is interview shows by comedians, which usually fall into the comedy category of podcasts. Is that also popular?
That it's also popular. It depends on the country that you are looking at. It really changes. And the amazing thing of being in a global marketplace is to see the difference from those countries. Comedy events on these types of podcasts, they are more popular, let's say, in the United States than if you compare it with the UK, for example. In US and Canada, you have podcasts talking about sports that really go up to the top, or not so much in the top, depending on sports events that's happening.
Yeah, that's right. You have such a global scale. I don't remember how many countries Triton operates in. How many countries does Triton operate in?
In 45 different countries.
I thought so. I thought it was in the 40s. So, well, that's interesting by itself. I mean, can you give me, this is an unexpected question, but can you give me any interesting facts about advertiser preferences in different countries that maybe would surprise me?
United States, that was mentioned, comedy and events is stronger than in different countries. Food and drink in the UK is pretty strong for advertisers. So it just brings us to think about, well, maybe they really like to talk about it in the UK. And in Canada, television shows, podcasts about TV are very popular for advertisers.
So interesting. You must observe these and think, why?
Yes. And a few of them we have like the one that I mentioned that I really like, that is magic and illusion. That it's really strong in the US. And say, people really want to learn or to know more about this fascinating thing that it's magic.
I wonder if this is a difficult or easy question to answer. What type of advertiser is trending in the programmatic marketplace that you manage?
Right. Again, just repeat saying that it depends on the country that you look.
Well, let's start with the US, the biggest market.
For the US, what's being trending and trends not just in podcasts is automotive. This is one that really trends in digital audio in general. But for podcasts specific, we're going to look at advertisers linked to health and fitness. That was something that grew a lot during the pandemic.
Of course.
Insurance companies, that is something that is always big. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we did saw a lot of finance advertisers coming into the podcast space.
Can you identify any patterns or changes? We're talking about the pandemic from 21 into 2022. Any patterns there that are notable to you?
We saw a few changes more in 2020 for 2021, like at the beginning of the pandemic, they were more, I would say the changes were more clear to see. We saw the device that it's being used to listen to music to change a lot. So it went a lot from mobile to desktops or devices that are not don't move around that much with us, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So we saw countries that originally would have almost dominance on mobile have increased for desktop devices. And I think that we saw in LATAM that was pretty interesting. LATAM is generally dominated by desktop devices, the listening.
This is Latin America, yeah.
Latin America, and we saw it moving more to mobile devices, a little bit against of movements that we saw around other places in the world. But one thing comparing 2021 with 2022 is, and specifically to podcast, is the increase of number of impressions and the interest in podcasts, how it has grown. In general, podcast impressions grew over 100% if you compare the first months of 2021 with the first months of 2022.
Impressions, this is advertising impressions.
Advertising impressions, yeah.
Grew,
so people buying.
Yep, they doubled. And is this is just in the programmatic podcast marketplace? Exactly.
That's what we observe in Triton's programmatic marketplace for podcasts.
All right. Well, that's an attention-getting statistic. So is this because the inventory has grown, people are listening more, and there are a lot more podcasts, or is it that programmatic is becoming a bigger force in podcasting?
I think that it's a mix of both, but that programmatic, it's becoming a bigger force in podcast makes a huge difference. As we talked at the beginning for the dynamic ad insertion, both podcasters are feeling more comfortable with the experience to dynamically insert an ad on their content, and buyers are feeling more comfortable in buying this type of really one-to-one experience, that it's the host talking to the public, talking to the listener. And platforms, SSPs, like supply-side platforms like Triton, this experience of inserting the ad goes so smoothly that the listener never knows, is it programmatic? Is it coming from the host itself? So this better listener experience attracts both people listening and people being able, be feeling comfortable to expose their inventory to programmatic, and people feeling comfortable in buying this.
I wonder about the cost of programmatic advertising. Can you give me any sense of CPMs?
Sure. In CPMs depends on the country, and as we have a global exposure, we do see a lot of that difference. We'll see that markets that are just starting in programmatic usually have very high prices for podcasts. They stay high if the supply is small. So for smaller countries, if you compare, let's say, Canada and US, being neighbors, those countries, but the population that lives on those countries are hugely numbers. Canada is outnumbered by the US. So Canadian market, you will see price in podcasts going closer to $10 or $15 in average. When in the US, you see that number closer to $5. So kind of half of the price of Canada.
Okay. Do you anticipate programmatic ad buying and ad selling to gain a larger and larger share over time?
That we do anticipate that, because that's from what we talked about, the advantages, the control that the buyer have, the transparency that buying this way allows buyer to in real time know where the ad delivered, really in which show the ad delivered. The publisher, it allows the publisher to know who bought it and everything in real time. So buyers can adjust the campaign. Publishers can make sure that the advertisers that they are receiving on their podcast match with what they believe and with their brand too. And this gives just it's more easy to everybody, for buyers and for publishers, and this transparency makes everybody knows who is buying and who is selling.
Well, Ivone Schramm, thank you for joining the Podcast Business Lunch and for tolerating my questions. I really appreciate it. I feel smarter than I was 20 minutes ago, and I'm sure that many people watching this feel that way too. Thanks again for being here.
My pleasure, Brad. Thank you for the invitation.
That's all for this week's podcast Business Lunch. My thanks to Ivone for making the time to do this, and also sincere thanks to our sponsors, Triton Digital and NPR. Without their support, the podcast Business Lunch would not be possible. Be sure to visit rainnews.com for more information about this series. You can even watch past episodes right on the website. And while you're there, make sure you're subscribed to the Rain Daily Digest newsletter. It is the preeminent trade publication for the combined online audio industries. Thanks for being here. I'm Brad Hill, and I'll talk to you next time.